Do you want to learn how to make pretty animations? Perhaps you want to animate a battle with your characters, or even animate your characters singing to a song you really like. Or maybe you saw something that sparked your interest in animation and you really want to learn it, but there's only one problem. You don't have the money for any fancy software. So where do you begin? Well, if you saw these animations and I told you that I made them with not a single penny spent on software, would you believe me? As a wise man once said, probably, it is the artist, not their tool. Why hello fellow people, that is where Krita comes in. Krita, for those who don't know, is a digital illustration software you can paint, make comics, and even animate with. No limitations, no free trials, because guess what? It's completely free. How this software is free is legit just beyond my understanding. Anyways, I've been taking animation seriously for nearly a year now, and hey, I know a thing or two about animating in Krita, so why not share my wisdom with for those who want to learn how to animate with it for the first time, or animators who just want to see what it's all about. Little disclaimer, this isn't really a basic animation tutorial. I will link a really great video for that below. Here, I'm just showing you my knowledge of Krita and my process using it when animating. The way I use it could be completely different to how someone else uses it, so yeah, remember that. And also, for this quote-unquote tutorial process behind the scenes, it's not really a tutorial, I'm just kind of showing you how I animate, I guess, in just the hopes that it helps you. I'm going to be using Krita 5, just mentioning this because this version of Krita will have some slight changes and even new tools added compared to older versions, so yeah, just pointing it out. So without any further ado, let's get on with it. So I'm going to assume that perhaps a few of you have some basic digital art knowledge, but for those who don't, especially if using Krita, I will go through some of the fundamentals. Also, even if you do have experience with Krita, I recommend to still watch this part since I go over the most common tools that I use, which are very important later on when it comes to the process of how I animate. So yeah, on to the fundamentals. So when you open Krita, this is what you'll see. You can create a new file or open a previous one. For today, we're going to click New. Now, I know this looks confusing, but let me explain. To the left, there are a couple of things here, but you can kind of explore them in your own time. They're not really important for today. On the Dimensions tab here, image size is the size that you want your canvas to be. This is what I use for creating most of my animations. You can also upscale your canvas later. I'll show you how to do that. Here, you can choose to have your canvas landscape or portrait. Today we're going to be going landscape. These 3 bits are just different ways you can choose the size of your canvas. Like instead of seeing how many pixels you have in your canvas, you can create your canvas based on how many centimeters you want it to be. Say you really like this canvas size and you won't be able to reselect it again at a later date. Go to Save Image As, and then name it whatever you want it to be, and then click Save, and then you should be able to find it again in the predefined tab. For content, you basically just mess around with your layers as a starting point, but we won't be really doing that today. And don't worry about color. Once you have selected the canvas size you're happy with, go to Create. Once you create your canvas, this is the default Krita layout. This thing here is the toolbar, which I'll quickly go over. Well, the tools that I use a lot anyway. This part here is basically the main tools for drawing. Like this one is the brush tool, which is, you know, very handy for drawing. This is the line tool, handy for drawing straight lines for like boxes and buildings and comic panels and stuff and straight lines and that stuff. And then there's the rectangle and ellipse tools, which are pretty self-explanatory. But wait, say you want this circle, for example, to fill in as soon as you draw it. Well, go over to the tool options box and go to fill and select foreground color, and bam, look at that, that's so cool, right? And there are a few other settings, so go nuts. Say you want to draw the perfect box. Well, here's a little quick pro tip. Press shift while you're drawing the box. It makes it just perfectly perfect. Yeah. Then there's a few other tools here which I don't use that much except this one. So let's say you have a really shaky hand and you want to draw a smooth line. There's this dynamic brush tool, which is basically just like a stabilizer tool. You can adjust the tool to your liking with the tools option box. It's your best friend. In this section, there's some transforming tools. The first one is, well, the transform tool, where you can transform whatever you draw. I use this to add some squash and stretch to my animation frames without redrawing it as like a shortcut. Say you want to resize this thing just perfectly without any squash or stretch to it. You just press shift while you're dragging it, and wow, you can resize it and it doesn't change shape at all. It's pretty neat. Next is the move tool, where you can just shuffle your drawing over a bit without distorting it. I also use this feature for an animation shortcut, which we will get into later. Then there's the crop tool, where you can just crop your canvas. Also, if you want to extend your canvas, go to whatever side you want to extend. Once you see this arrow, press it and bam, canvas extended. I use this a lot for making backgrounds in my animations. While we're on the topic of canvas, I'm gonna teach you how to rescale your canvas. So basically, go up to image and you go to scale image to new size, and you can just choose how many pixels or whatever you want it to be, and look at that, it's bigger. It's bigger. Also, if you don't like the shape of your canvas, you can go up to image and then resize canvas, and you can just change it to whatever you want. Next is the gradient tool, which I use for some extra flair in my animations, which we will get to later on. Next is the color picker tool, I think it's called anyway, where say you want this exact color. Select the tool and click on the color, and look at that, you have the exact color you wanted. The next tool I use is the bucket tool, which fills in blocks of color. For the bucket tool, there are a few things we need to go over. So having the bucket tool selected, I can go over to the tool option. The main bit we're going to go over is the what to fill option. When you have the lasso toolbox selected, when you go to fill the canvas, it fills the entire thing with color, no matter what is there. Beside the lasso toolbox is a magic wand tool with some layers, and oh my gosh, so many options. Don't worry, I'll briefly explain everything for you. For the fill with function, you can choose to fill with the foreground color, which fills in the color that you have selected on your color wheel, which is this thing, by the way. It's pretty self-explanatory. I never used the fill with background function, but you can explore that by yourself if you want. And then there's the fill with pattern function, which, would you see this icon up here? This is filled with just different patterns, which I will occasionally use for adding some texture to my art. So the main settings for the bucket tool, or the ones I commonly use, is first the threshold, which, say you have this triangle here. When you have the threshold at 1, you can see it leaves a little white pixel. But when you put it up all the way to 100, it covers everything. So you need to mess around with the slider a bit until it's just right, and bam, no white pixel. The grow tool is very handy. For an example, say you fill in this box. Notice the white pixel edge, add a couple of pixels to the grow function, and look at that, no pixels. I don't use the feather tool often, but basically the lower it is, the more harder the fill is, and the higher it is, the more softer it is. Then beside the fill bucket tool, there's the enclose and fill tool, which basically is just like the fill bucket tool, but you draw with it. Either it be freehand, or a rectangle, or an eclipse, etc. I don't use it much, sometimes on the odd occasion, however feel free to experiment with it a bunch. Next up is the reference section, which is probably a good time to mention layers. Layers are basically like transparent pieces of paper stacked on top of each other, and they are your best friend. This button here is to only fill the bucket tool on the layer that you are on. The next is to reference all the layers on the canvas. This is handy if you have multiple line art layers. And next is the labeled layers, which I don't really use much, but basically you can color code your layers, and the bucket tool will respond to those color-coded layers. The assistant tool is handy for perspective and drawing characters and backgrounds. I use it sometimes, but we won't be using it today. And the measure tool I have never used, but what I do use though is the reference image tool. Are you sick of dragging references onto your canvas, only having to shift them around because they get in your way of your drawing? Well, introducing this handy tool where you can add references outside the canvas. You do this by copying an image you want, go into the pin button, and then paste it in. And look at that, you can move it in and outside the canvas. Feel free to mess around with it. These 4 tools here are the selection tools. The rectangle and ellipse ones are exactly like the shape tools, and they're handy if you want to draw some silhouette buildings or circles. The polygonal tool is just what it is, a polygonal tool. And the lasso tool is basically just drawing what you want to select. The last selection tool that I use is a magic wand tool, which is pretty cool for filling a character in with color. The settings for the magic wand tool is basically just the same as the bucket tool. To deselect, go up to select, and then deselect. You can also do this to reselect something as well, and you can even make your own shortcuts for it. The last 2 tools on the toolbar are the zoom tool, where you can zoom in and out as you please. You can also do this by pressing minus and plus on your keyboard. And then finally, there's the pan tool, where you can just move around the canvas as you please. And that's all the tools that I use on Krita at the toolbar. Next up is shortcut keys, where basically you can assign a function on Krita to any button on your keyboard or drawing tablet to quickly select any tool at will, instead of going to, the toolbar. Shortcuts save so much time, and there's so many options, but go crazy, personalize Krita's tools to your liking. Next up is layers, which I briefly mentioned before, but here are some quick tips. This is a lock icon, where when you click it, it locks your layer, so you cannot edit it. This is very handy if you're the artist who accidentally draws line art on the sketch layer. Beside it is the clipping function. To activate the clipping mask, select the layers that you want to clip. Press Ctrl G or right click, hover on grip, then quick grip. Then go on the layer that you want to clip and press this button here and bam! Next up is the alpha lock button, which is also at the top of the canvas as well. Once you press it, whatever you draw cannot go out of what you've already drawn on that selected layer. This is very helpful for colouring. Also, on the left of every layer there's this little eye, and when you click it, it can turn your layers on and off. Down here there are a few more buttons. This button is for adding a new layer. You can click the arrow beside it, and you can add all sorts of different layers, which we won't really get into much today. And then here's the layer properties. These two arrows are for moving your layers up and down. You can also do this by click dragging your layers up and down as well. And then there's the bin icon for the layers you want to delete. Also, if you double click a layer, you can rename it. And to merge your layers or a grouped layer, press Ctrl E. Also, say you have this squiggly line on this layer and you don't want that squiggly line there, you just want to delete it. You can just press delete on your keyboard and the whole layer will just be cleared. Next up is layer modes, which basically, oh gosh, how do I explain this? Basically, it's better to experiment with layer modes for yourself. However, I should tell you the most common ones that I use. For shading, I use linear burn or multiply. For adding highlights, I use color dodge or add, or addition, or add glow, whatever it's called. Sometimes I want to add a slight change of color to a piece. I will use overlay. See this blue noise I have here? Which you can make by filling the canvas with a color, go to filter, other, and random noise. I can select overlay, and look at that, pretty cool. And say I want to change the blue noise to orange, I can go up here, which can change the mode of your brush, not just a layer, and I use the color layer mode, and look at that, the noise is orange! Then there's the opacity, which you can use to adjust the harshness of a layer. For an example, this overlay layer is just too, harsh, you know? So, I just kinda wanna make it less in your face, so to do that, I turn down the opacity, and look at that! Also for complete beginners, you can also use the opacity to make your sketch layer lighter when you do line art. Next is the brush presets, where you can select any brush you want. What I do is if I find a brush I really like, I'll right click it and assign it to a tag I made. And to make a tag, basically you go here and look at that, a tag. Krita has so many brushes and you'll need to mess around with a lot of them until you find ones you really like. Here are mine: an eraser, an airbrush, a flat round brush, a round brush with opacity depending on how hard I press on my tablet. I also have a pressure sensitive round brush, a rough pen which I use for line art, a pencil, a paintbrush, watercolor brush, and a couple blending tools, and a couple of rake tools, and this green tone brush. Up the top here there are a few buttons. This is where you click to create a new canvas, open a canvas, or save your current canvas, which you can also do with Ctrl S. Next, there's undo and redo. For undo, if you haven't assigned your own shortcut for it, press Ctrl Z. This part over here is the layer modes for the brush you are using. There's an eraser, an alpha lock, and then for the current brush you are using, you can adjust the opacity, and then you can also adjust the flow and pattern scale, which I never use. And then you can adjust the scale of your brush, which you can also do by moving your brush in your canvas while holding shift. The next two tools I use are just the mirror tools. I use the horizontal tool a lot when drawing something that's symmetrical on both sides. You can also do some minor adjustments to the tools by pressing the arrows beside them. And before we move on, I've got a couple of tips for you. At the bottom of your canvas, to rotate, you can press this little circle and move it around. Or you can press 4 on your keyboard to go left, 6 to go right, and 5 to reset. Then there's a slider where you can change the size of your canvas as well. And even further back at the top, there's some more buttons. My advice is to explore them for yourself. However, the ones I use the most is filter and blur. I use blur a lot for my animations, like motion blur and lens blur and all that stuff. I just thought I'd point that out as I use it a little bit later on. And I also use noise, which I mentioned before. Now, a little fun thing with Krita is that you don't like the default window setup. You can drag things around and position them to your liking. And even if you accidentally delete something, please don't worry. The first time I accidentally deleted the color wheel, for an example, I panicked. I was like, oh no, it's gone forever. But don't worry, because all you need to do is go to settings, then Dockers, just reselect the tool you deleted, and look, it's back, it's still here, don't worry. Up in this little icon here is the workspace button. Basically, there are default workspaces for different things: painting, vectors, storyboarding, animation, etc, etc. You can also create your own by adjusting the workspace the way you want, adding stuff from the Dockers window, etc. And then you go to the workspace window and name your workspace and save it, and it will always be there. I have my own custom workspaces for illustration, animation, and storyboarding. I haven't added much in the default Krita window except an overview tab which allows me to move around the canvas very quickly, zoom in, rotate, mirror it, which you can also do by pressing M. I also added a quick settings docker which allows me to change my brush to an exact size. Krita has a storyboard function which is neat, so you can even write your own comments too and export it like this. It's pretty neat for those who like storyboarding and want to do that before they move on to properly animating. Finally, to the animation timelines. Yes, I said timelines because there are two. To bring them up, you can go to the workspace icon, press animation, or you can just go to settings, dockers, animation timeline, and animation curve. Now let me tell you how these work. Let's start with the animation timeline, shall we? To create a keyframe, you can press this button right here, and to duplicate a keyframe, you press this one, or you can just copy and paste a keyframe by right-clicking on a keyframe and clicking copy keyframes and paste keyframes. I said keyframes a lot there. I have my own shortcut for this as I do that a lot. And to remove a keyframe, you can just press this button right here. To go back and forth between keyframes, you can press these buttons, or you can just press the up arrow on your keyboard to go through them. These two buttons here are for going through the animation frame by frame, or you can just press the left and right arrow keys. And finally, these two are the pause and play buttons. Moving along, this is the keyframe number, and all the way over to the right, you have the onion skin tab where you can adjust the opacity and the colors of the previous and upcoming frames. You can turn the onion skin on and off with a light bulb you'll see beside the layers that have keyframes. Also, speaking of layers, you'll notice that the layers in the timeline have a pin beside them. If you don't want a layer in your timeline, click that pin and it's gone. If you want to pin a layer to the timeline, go to the layer itself, right click, and then pin to timeline. Then there's this button. You can choose if you want your animation to start and stop at any keyframe. This is very handy for making a more longer animation and only want to watch a certain part of it over and over again. Then there's the frame rate, which you can adjust. The frame rate can depend on the project, but most of the time I tend to use roughly 12. On the left here where all the layers are, you can hold this and move it left and right to make your timeline bigger or smaller. And then also on the left of the animation timeline there's a speaker button, and when you click on it you can import audio or remove audio. I suggest using a WAV format. WAV, I don't know how you say it. W-A-V. But you can also try an MP3 if you want. I'm not sure how well it works though, but you can give it a shot. On the speaker button you can also adjust the volume of the audio as well. And then back over here you can slow down or speed up your animation, which can I say is super handy for lip syncing. And now there's the animation curve feature, which you may or may not be wondering what the difference between the two are. The animation timeline is for frame by frame animation, where the animation curve is more of a point A to point B thing where you can distort the keyframe and timing. I use the animation curve feature for panning backgrounds, moving my character occasionally, and yeah, you'll see me use this feature later. Now you may be wondering, how on earth do you use it? First, select a layer you want to use. Sometimes if you have like a background for an example that you want to move, I'd recommend copying the group layer that it's in case you mess up or something, and then merge the copied group, right click and go to add, and then press transform. This will turn the background into a transform layer, and then press the button here to create a new keyframe. The icon beside it will remove a keyframe. Basically now you can just adjust the background however you want with the transform tool. Now you may be wondering what these buttons here are, and I have no idea. I honestly don't use them, but I'm sure they do something. Basically this is just how I use the animation curve tool. I just use the keyframe thing. I don't really use anything fancy for it because I'm not very experienced with it. But this kind of tutorial thing is just more of a process video of anything and how I use Krita and just sharing what I know about the program. So yeah, Krita just has so many features that even to this day I'm still finding new functions. Now, how are you feeling? Stressed? Overwhelmed? Me too! The best thing I can suggest is just use what I said into practice. You don't learn how to ride a bike by watching someone do it, you gotta do it yourself, so have fun. But wait, we aren't over. So I recorded most of an 8-hour animation I made the other day, and the reason I went through all the fundamentals of Krita is so that you can sort of understand what on earth I'm going to be talking about during my process, which starts right now. The first thing I did was import the audio for this animation, being a clip from the song Dream On, and tying by Sketchy Animatic to the clip. And also drawing a bit of the background, foreground, I don't know, the mirror, so I knew where to like animate the character. I wish you could see that part, but I like forgot to record the first 10 minutes or so. And then I thought, you know, why don't I try an animation method that takes a long time, but since I can cheat the system with it, it won't be so bad. I was half true. Now you may be wondering, what is this animation method? So look at this. This is a finished animation. Probably from your point of view it looks hand-drawn, framed by nearly every frame, right? Wrong. You see, my master plan was to give the illusion that a lot of it was hand-drawn, when really I drew 2 versions of the head and the body and copy, paste and adjust with the move and the transform tool. Now hey, this animation method might seem a little complicated, especially when you look at my timeline more later on, but in the long run it saved me a lot of time. I mean, the line art just took me over 3 hours according to OBS, and we'll get to that later. Basically what I'm doing here is, you know how I am copying and pasting the same 2 frames over and over again? Well, to keep track of what frame is what, I color coded them, since you can do that. It's a lifesaver. Well anyways, here I'm blocking out the very basic parts of the animation to the animatic keyframes. The body and head are separated to make my life easier. We will get to the face and lip sync later. When I animate and stuff, basically when you copy and paste, my advice is to try and make the frames bounce, add squash and stretch with the transform tool, and just no one to exaggerate and all that stuff. And then, when I finish out blocking the main keyframes, I start in betweening the transitions between each movement, and when there are parts where the character, who's called Erin by the way, doesn't move much in the animatic, I listen to the audio and move her head and body to match the lyrics, to kind of make it more lively. Like for an example, have you ever watched a Disney movie where a song comes on and the characters just stare soullessly at the viewer? That would be boring and terrifying. The characters move, and even real singers do that too. So even though Erin is just staring at themselves in the mirror having, let's just say, a bad time, they don't look so good. I want them to, you know, really look like they're singing. Even though in character they wouldn't really sing as they're quite shy and quite easily embarrassed. Unless my comic was a musical, then I guess that would make sense, but anyways. Also, I tried to make them look a little horrified, as without spoiling my comic, many bad things happened to them. All they wanted was to go to an art school, but to just get caught up in a bunch of chaos and suffer a lot. Oh, I can't wait to get to all of that. Although I worked out if I do a chapter per month, my full comic will take around 6 years to finish. But considering the pace I'm going at, it's gonna take much more longer than that, as all I do is animate all the time. But this isn't about my comic, this is about animation. So anyways, back to the normal stuff. After I finish blocking out the head and the body, and animate the in-betweens using the transform and move tool, I start to do line art for the hand. I make a new layer for the hand outside the mirror, and a new one for the reflection inside the mirror. Breaking it all up like this just makes it a lot more easier, as later I want to add some gradients and lighting to Erin's reflection without making her hand on the outside get caught up in all of it. Also, you may notice that I change the colour of my line art when I draw Erin's head, body, hand, reflection, hand, let's just call it. This makes it a lot easier to me so I can see what's what basically. After all that, we're on to animating Erin's eyes, eyebrows, and injury on their head. The reason I separated the top part of their face from their head is to kind of add more movement to it without making it look all stiff. If you look at the final animation, you'll notice that their eyes bounce around a lot. Sure, this might not be entirely realistic, but it gives the animation more movement. Now we're in the flats, which actually just took me over an hour. Basically, to remind you what I'm doing here, all I did was just divide my animation to different parts for the line art, the head, the body, the face, the hand on the outside of the mirror, so they're all in their own little groups, and dividing them like this might seem complicated, but it just makes stuff a lot easier, as I mentioned before. And it also just saves me a lot of time having to clean up a lot of the line art as well. Like for an example, if I merged the line art for Erin's head and body together, I'd have to remove every frame of line art on the neck behind her head, and that's time consuming. So it may look a little horrifying when it's all separated, but it just saved myself a lot of time by doing it this way. Also, by filling the flats, you notice that the threshold goes up and down. I do this sometimes. In some parts of Erin, the line art is like really sharp at corners, and the line art is also close together in some other parts, so putting the slider up makes it easier to fill it all in. However, if there are colours that are quite close in tone like Erin's skin and the white of their eyes, putting the threshold down really helps fill that in. So I hope that makes sense. Look at that, we're at the shading now. I don't have too much to say except I shade the warm lighter colours of an orangey red and the cools like white, brown and green with a blue. It looks nicer to me, and even though these colours for the shading is quite saturated and vibrant, especially for quite a dull and more serious tone scene, don't worry, the shading here won't reflect how the scene looks in the end, as I'll add some special effects, which we'll talk about later. Also, I love how as the time-lapse progresses, you can just see my timeline get more and more chaotic. When I was working on this, I wasn't sure how pretty the final result would look, since I like making my animations look visually pretty, and in this stage it just looks really basic. Not that that's bad, it's just not what I was going for. But anyway, I kept most of the shading on one layer, except for the shading on the hand outside the mirror that is clipped to its own layer group. I didn't shade the iris, one to sort of make Eren look more off, and if you're wondering what the white pupil is all about, that is spoilers for my comic, so I cannot say, but it's kind of related to the injury in their forehead. Also, there's another reason why I don't shade the pupil just yet, but you'll find that out very soon. Also, for those wondering, I used the lasso tool to shade their hair and add highlights to it. It was just the most quickest method for that. And now for the lip syncing. I wish you could hear me lip sync this in real time, but I can't since the copyright man will get me. But it went well. I had the line art for the lip sync and the flats for it on its own layers. Also, since lip syncing is like really tricky sometimes, I slowed down the animation with the speed bar you can see on the animation timeline, as it really helps. And basically you listen to the audio again and again and again until you get it just right. I'm not perfect at lip syncing, but I think it looks decent enough. Just make sure that the mouth movements match the character, the audio, and the emotion of the character. Like here, I wouldn't draw Eren smiling, as that wouldn't fit the scene at all. As like I mentioned, Eren goes through some really tough stuff, and my comic is happy with some more sadder scenes sprinkled in until the end of arc 2. And then, at the end of that arc, stuff just happens. Now we're on to the background, where I just paint, well, the background, very loosely. I don't go into too much detail, as one, you won't be paying attention to it, and two, I don't want it to distract you from the main focus being Eren. It was just a very quick thing to paint. Next, I paint the wall on the mirror, and again, I don't go into too much detail here, as I blurred them out a little later to make you focus more on Eren, so I just add some quick shadows and highlights. And finally, my favourite part where I feel like the animation really comes together, the effects. This is just where my animations start to look pretty. First of all, I make sure all the layers relating to Eren are just in one really big group, so I can put shadows and stuff on top of them without interfering with the backgrounds. Also, I made sure the backgrounds are in their own groups as well. Then I create a multiply layer and adjust the opacity. I also added a gradient to it as well, just to make it look nicer. Then I duplicate it 3 times so they're all in the 2 background groups and the character group, and Eren's hand outside the mirror. Doing this makes Eren and the room they're in look like they're in darkness and give off a more moody atmosphere. On the bottom corner of the mirror where Eren's hand appears, to separate it and the reflection of Eren's hand, I added a white gradient to it. Then in Eren's character group, I added a line of shadow with a more vibrant edge, and I made sure this layer was on linear burn, and I blurred it just a little bit. Now remember how I mentioned that I didn't shade Eren's eyes? Well, the reason was because I wanted them to glow in the dark. So I turned off all the effects, select a vibrant orangey red, and then use the fill bucket tool on a new layer to fill Eren's iris for every single frame, and once that is done, I put all my effect layers back on, and then I change the layer mode of Eren's iris to addition. And then sometimes I will also use color dodge for this, but I felt like addition looked better in this occasion. Sometimes I'll blur Eren's glowing eyes by going through it frame by frame, but this time I felt like removing some of the glowiness of the airbrush, and I just really like how it looks. Wow, that was a lot. Are you still with me? Great, because we're not done. Since Eren's line art is all black except for the pupils of their eyes, I move the line art relating to their head above the shadows, and then I go through it frame by darn frame and use the airbrush to create a nice gradient of white on their hair and their jawline. I'll add a couple of gradients here and there as well, like a black gradient at the bottom of Eren so you really focus on their face. I'll also use the airbrush to put some orange and blue on either side of Eren, and then I'll just put that to color dodge. It just adds some more flair. But I also felt like Eren needed a little bit more, so I thought I'll just add this triangle of light on their cheek. And here I had 2 options. I could place this triangle of light everywhere I wanted it frame by frame with the animation timeline, but I decided to use the second option, being the animation curve, where I can just put it in some frames and it will move it to point A to point B, so I went with that option since it's the quickest thing to do. And finally, I swear we're almost done here, so remember the layer group of Eren's hand outside the mirror? Well, I go into the line art in that layer and add a white gradient frame by frame. Then I duplicate the group, turn off the original group layer, merge the copied version of the group layer, and then blur it frame by frame. I have a shortcut for blurring it so it saves a lot of time, and I also blurred the mirror just a little bit as well. And look at that! Finally, we're finished! Did you understand a single word I said? Probably not, but I hope this was somewhat useful. I am so bad at putting my art process into words, as it makes sense in my head, but I just find it really difficult explaining it to other people, but dang it, I tried. Hello, it's me again. I just completely forgot to go over how to render your animations. How did I forget this? But hey, at least I remembered. What you're going to want to do is go to File, and then Render Animation. And then here you have a few options. At Export, you can choose to render your animation a couple of ways. The first is Image Sequence, which will just render your frames as just images. You can render it as a video, or you can render it as just both. Down below is first frame and last frame. First frame, what frame you want your animation to start, and the last frame is just where you want your animation to end. Next to it is width and height, which is just the size of your canvas. And then you've got the frames per second, and you've got the filter thing, which I don't know much about. And down below is FFmpeg, which is very important because if you don't have it, then you can't render your animation in a video, so you need to download that, but I will link that below. Next is render as, so you can choose to render your animation as a bunch of different things. You can render it as a GIF, you can render it as an MP4, etc. I just choose MP4. Then you can choose where you want to save your rendered animation, and you can also choose if you want to include your audio or not. That should be it, hopefully, and then once you've just selected the options that you like, just press OK and it'll render, and that's it done. Hopefully I covered everything. I hope it helps. I guess we'll see. If you have any questions, let me know and I'll try and help. But yeah, basically this is just how I animate in Krita. Everyone will probably use Krita differently. You really just need to explore the software for yourself, adjust some settings, the layout, find brushes you like, etc. Think of Krita like a friend. When you first meet them, you don't understand a thing about them, but spend time with them, get to know them, and you'll understand them more, and you'll just feel more comfortable with them. It's a weird analogy, but I guess it makes sense. Anyway, I don't know how long this thing is all gonna be, but I've been talking for a long time. I'm gonna go and work on my webcomic. Until next time.